Taylor, your instructor for American History Part 1 to 1877. This is the video for the week overview of Forging the New Nation, which is the chapter for this week in the textbook, and for our module for this week. And I'll go over, preview that for you this week, plus the readings. And I also want to talk about the midterm this week and then next week, because the midterm is coming up. You have less than 2 weeks now to get it in. And I'll go over that this assignment today. I'll probably leave another video later in the week, hopefully. I'll talk about that in a second, but that's what we'll go through in this little video here. A couple things before I get into this. Just grades have been posted already for last week. I want to commend everybody for keeping up with the readings, for keeping up with the discussion and everything. You guys did a good job. I'll have a little more about it. I'll send an email out later today, just some feedback on that. But you guys mostly have what I want you to do, and I hope you're taking the opportunity now that you know what I want from you to learn from each other in discussion. That's a big thing. When you guys don't understand something, don't have a better understanding of it, of the text or the textbook or the readings, you can learn from each other. There are some smart people in your classes, by the way, and you can learn from them as well as you can from me. And I know you've been great, by the way, with asking for feedback and communicating with me. I really appreciate it. It helps me as a teacher, and so I appreciate you, learning with me as you go along and helping me out in the class. So keep up good work, and we'll try to get you moving forward toward the midterm. All right. So the module for this week deals with, I think the chapter in your textbook is Hammering Out a Federal Republic. And basically what this chapter is about, what this week is about forming a new country, basically, because the United States isn't one country really at its birth. We have a government before we have a country, a nation. And so what this deals with is the creation of different visions for the country. In particular, the chapter will talk about Alexander Hamilton's vision for the country, which is the Federalist vision. We'll come to that in a second, which envisions a strong national government with a strong economic policy, one which encourages, industry, trade, those sorts of things, and which plays a federal government that plays a role in developing the new nation. Doing things like creating a national debt. You can blame or thank Alexander Hamilton for that. And actually, it's one of the things that creates a modern economy in the United States, because, if you have a debt, the whole reason to have a debt, by the way, is so you can borrow money against it, which is what the United States does almost immediately once Alexander Hamilton gets the new Congress to buy into that. And so you have one vision there, which is, about that vision of the country, versus that of Thomas Jefferson, which is much different. It envisions a republic of small farmers, artisans, the salt of the earth types, and one which is very decentralized, localized in terms of its government, which emphasizes, and you'll see this going forward, there's a theme going on here, the rights of the states, which doesn't want a strong federal government. Ironic, of course, coming from a slaveholder himself, Thomas Jefferson, that he should advocate for something like this. But he has reasons for this. They go back to Republican ideals of citizenship, that you should be independent-minded. That's why you don't want, big corporations, if you like. I'm using that's an anachronism, by the way. He doesn't use the term big corporations. But he distrusts those types of interests, moneyed interests. It's a bad term for someone like Jefferson, because they do make dependence out of people. And you'll get a really nice selection from one of his writings in the Major Problems chapter for this week, where he talks about his Republican ideals. Very fascinating. Also from Hamilton as well. You'll get what their visions looked like in their own words. And so you have the creation of these two visions, and you also have the creation of parties around these two visions, because very quickly within the presidency of George Washington, you have Hamilton and Jefferson sort of butting heads. They're in the same presidency, by the way. They're in his cabinet. Washington has Jefferson and Adams as his vice president, all these founding fathers in his cabinet. And they will coalesce into different parties. And you will have the creation of a two-party system at the end of the 1790s. John Adams is elected to succeed Washington when he steps down. But you'll have the creation of a Federalist Party, which is mostly based in the Northeast, which is, again, favors that sort of Hamiltonian vision, generally speaking, but is also different in social composition in the sense that the Federalists come from the Northeast. They come from old families. They value things like family connections, and they think of themselves as being the best men of the early republic. They think politics should be something done by the best families, the best people, the best connections, those sorts of things. And this will be opposed by Jefferson, the people who are coalesced around him, who think, quite frankly, politics should be more democratic, more open to people from different, not necessarily social ranks as well, but it shouldn't be about that, essentially. And you'll have really serious ideological clashes in the presidency of Adams, and then building up to the election of 1800, which is kind of a watershed, mainly because things are going to get kind of heated, to say the least, during the election of 1800. We just had, of course, a very, very heated election this past year. But in 1800, this was the first time it had, Washington had been the hero of the country, so he passes it off to his lieutenant Adams. It wasn't a big of a deal. But now you have competing factions, competing political divisions, which George Washington, of course, did not want, famously in his farewell address. There were some people that thought this was going to lead to a civil war, that there was going to be armed rumors of this in 1800. But election went off without a hitch. Jefferson wins, and the big deal, of course, is it's a peaceful transfer of power. So it sets a precedent that no one wants to break. And important because there are people who expected the early republic, to fall apart. People in Europe and Britain thought, hey, they're so contentious and cantankerous. They fought with us. They can't, get along with each other. And they managed to pull it off. So it's a big deal in 1800. Sometimes called the Revolution of 1800 because it is revolutionary for a variety of reasons. One of which is it brings Jefferson to power. Federalists, and George Washington was more or less a Federalist. He may have been above the fray because he was so popular, basically, but he was essentially a Federalist, even though he was from Virginia. And Jefferson coming into power changes things. Jefferson, I mentioned, being more of a Democrat by more naturally a Democrat, and that's not the Democratic Party of our party, but democratic in terms of his instincts as a ruler and a leader. Jefferson spent a lot of the time of the Revolution actually in Europe, like John Adams when he came back. Remember when the Constitution's being made, there's this big push to sort of, rein in the excesses of democracy with the electoral college, all that stuff put into the Constitution. Jefferson wasn't really on board with all this. He didn't like it that much. And started falling out almost immediately with people like Hamilton and increasingly his friend, John Adams, over these sorts of things. And so when he got into the White House, he didn't and his policies were essentially more decentralizing than the Federalists. You'll read about this in detail, but he wanted decentralized government, reduce the budget, those sorts of things. He was a budget hawk in modern terms. But he also felt like he was the sort of tutor of the Republic. It was his job as president to teach everybody how to be good Republican citizens and not act like those, act like you're living in a monarchical society. And to give you just a couple of, instances of this, he changed things in the White House. He changed White House ceremony. What does that mean? During the presidency of George Washington, when you came to see the White House, people visited the White House, George Washington would greet people with a bow, almost like, it's a court ceremony, the courts of Europe, the British monarchy. And people would be seated at events, dinners, official state dinners, according to their rank, their social status. Well, as soon as Jefferson gets into office, he begins greeting people at the White House official functions with a handshake. Democratic, or, blah, 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 we're all equal. He begins seating people at state dinners by who happens to come into the door first. And so, again, it's these little things he's changing to try to, again, it's kind of arrogant, but he thinks he's the tutor of the new republic in some regard, in those regards. And so he changes a lot of things that way, gives us a different tone to where the republic's going to go politically speaking. And again, people like Adams and Washington, the early Federalists, well, quite honestly, people that made the revolution in a lot of ways, did not expect the way the republic was going to become. They thought it was going to be a gentleman's republic, be the republic of virtue, where the best men rule and stuff like this. They expected that. And going forward from Jefferson, move forward in the or decades of the 19th century, it's going to become something very different. That sort of democratic push from below is going to slowly reshape what the American society had been and change its development. You'll see this, and mostly the political aspect of this this chapter. Next chapter, you'll get the cultural side of it. But Jefferson's a good sort of, I want to say symbol, but a good example of that at the presidential level. One of the other things you'll talk about in here as well is westward expansion. Almost immediately from the time Revolution ends, you have the United States pushing west and pushing into Indian territory in the upper Northwest. They almost immediately expand and sort of annex, if you like, or create territories out of the Northwest. This is the Northwest Ordinance. You'll read about this, and begin sort of, pushing the Indians out of their land. This is one of the unpleasant aspects of the early republic. Without much, by the way, not many qualms about it, and you'll see how that happens, and how that plays into migration patterns as European settlers move west and move into different areas of the continent. The other thing you'll have, well, two major elements that are actually connected is the War of 1812, which will deal with the first major foreign policy event of the early republic, in which we go to war with Britain. Long story short, Britain's at war with revolutionary France, and both Britain and France begin impressing, that is to say, kidnapping our sailors, forcing them to work in their navies. They need extra hands. The United States protests at this. It really has no power to force either of those two great powers to stop doing it. But Britain is preoccupied with fighting the French, and so a war party in Congress manages to push through a war in 1812 against the British. And as you're going to see, it was, for the most part, it wasn't a big deal to the British. It was kind of, this is our light work. We're not going to worry about it too much. It was a big deal to the Americans. It was bound up with questions of their own national identity. By the way, I didn't assign it to you, but there's a wonderful short essay, a secondary source, in Chapter 6. I think it's Foreign Policy, Westward Expansion, about this issue, about how the War of 1812 was about a war of national identity. Because even as late as the early 1800s, you have people who, people who were born in Britain becoming American citizens. And of course, to the British, anybody born in Britain, they're a British citizen, and they're, this is why they're impressing sailors. It's one of their justifications for it. So it's an interesting dynamic, that War of 1812, which of course ends in a stalemate. We win this battle at the Battle of New Orleans 2 weeks after the war has already been ended, which makes the career of Andrew Jackson, the general who wins the battle, be very important going forward. Another major thing that happened as a result of this is that the that two-party system, the Federalists and the Republicans, essentially it comes to an end by the end of the War of 1812. By 1820, the first federal party is basically defunct. And they're defunct because they opposed the war. In fact, they opposed it so harshly and roundly, some people actually were advocating things like political secession from the Union, which once word of that, you'll see this, how this happens, once word of that gets out, it kills off the First Federalist Party, even though it will live on in the guise of the federal judiciary. The first Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, John Marshall, you'll see in your textbook, very famous, is a Federalist. And so Federalist ideals remain part of the Republic, even though the first party dies by the end of the period here. So that's a preview of this week's history of the Republic. And the readings you'll get, the primary sources are very good. They give you, I mentioned before, some excerpts from Jefferson, Hamilton's writings. The essay also for this week that I assign, I think it's pages 170 to 176, is also concerning what national identity amounts to. And I'm going to come back to this in a moment because your midterm, as you're going to see, and your final essay are going to concern those topics. But they're both good. You should pay attention to that secondary source. They'll help you, ground you for going forward for that essay. Which, let's get to that really quickly. and talk about the midterm. Now, some of you, I've been telling you for weeks now to try to start on this and to get into it. I'm sure most of you haven't done this, so I want to go through. I'm going to go through and read through the assignment here, basically, and tell you what it means and talk about it real quickly. And I'll go through this again, like I said, in a few days. But basically, you're going to have the same topic for the midterm and the final. But the topic, of course, is national identity. And I'm going to read this aloud. And the essay assignment says, from the period of colonization to the early 1820s, a diverse mix of cultures, races, religions, and even natural environments shaped the European settlements of North America and then the nascent United States of America. That's the sort of preamble to it. And the assignment says, write a 4 to 5 page essay which crafts a narrative of how an American national identity emerged over the long term, from the period of the first colonization in the 1500s to the early 1800s. Now, I want to stop there for a moment because somebody mentioned this to me the other day. That's very broad, and it is. Although I give you 3 specific items you're going to have in your essay really quickly. I'm doing that because, quite frankly, it's more interesting, I think, if I give you guys a big topic to go through. This isn't something, by the way, if you were to go into graduate school, if you wanted to be an academic historian, you would almost, well, at least not in graduate school, write about anything so broad. We usually prefer very specific topics, questions. I'm doing this. This is an academic history. I'm giving you an introduction to what it is historians do, and I want you to do something that's interesting and something that's topical. This is a big debate. We're still having debates about our national identity, obviously, in our politics and outside of politics. And so I wanted to give that to you as a way of learning the process of how historians actually go about doing what they do. And so to come back to the assignment really quickly, the question you have to answer is this: what long-term developments had shaped American national identity by the 1800s? And so your essay should be an answer to that question. That is to say, when you write it, you should have that question. You might even put it at the top of your paper, by the way, so that you can remind yourself, okay, I'm putting all this, because you have all this detail you have to remember. It's kind of hard to remember stuff in your head or cull from your notes, the textbook, or the sources. It has to come back ultimately to that question, because the question you ask determines the answer you're going to get from the sources and how you're going to tell that. So I'll read the question again. What long-term developments shaped American national identity by the 1800s? And it says your essay should include all of the following. Number 1, it should include a clear definition of what American national identity, and I have that in quotation marks, was or meant for Americans in the early 1800s. One of the many, many problems I have had with students, they will talk about what American national identity, what we think in the present tense in 2017 or 2016, last semester, American national identity is today. I don't care about that. I mean, you can talk about a little bit at the end of the essay if you want to slip that in there. But I want to know what Americans in the early 1800s thought it was. And be as specific as you can, be as detailed as you can, because you're going to have, I think, problems, even though it's broad. I want to write. Be specific. That specificity is always better than. Okay, sorry about that malfunction there. As I was saying, specificity is always better than vague answers when you're talking about what you're writing about in these essays. And so, so the first part is define. You should define this, by the way, early on in your paper. In the introduction, you can talk about what do you think American national identity is, or you can have your introductory paragraph, then in the first body paragraph introduce what that means for people, for Americans in the early 1800s, as you go back to that. So that's the first part of the essay. The second thing you'll have to have in the essay, number 2, which specific developments contributed to this idea over the long term, and how they contributed to this. Now, what I want to say is, okay, you break down the definition of what, okay, American national identity is. And you might include, you probably will, because it was, you will say, well, ideas about liberty contributed to this over, to the American national identity over the long term, by the early 1800s. And then you'll go into, okay, where did they get these ideas of liberty from? And you can give, there's all sorts of answers for this. You might think they came from the Enlightenment, right? And you'll say, well, Enlightenment ideals partly inspired the American revolutionaries. They took those ideas, they opposed Great Britain with them, then they, of course, use them to build a new government. That would be one way of talking about an element in that and how they shaped this component of national identity. And the third thing is, the third thing you have to have in your essay is properly cited sources that back up the claims you make in your essay. This essay is not required to be an exact, I'm not giving you exacting academic standards. It's a sort of, think of it as a quasi-academic work. You will have to cite. I'll go into this in more detail next video or two. Basically, you are basically limited to two things for sources. One, your textbook, and two, the major problem source reader. You should have plenty of sources in there for an essay of this sort. It's broad. It's meant to be sort of, think of it as an opinion piece backed up with sort of academic-like arguments in which you have sources which you cite. And in terms of citation, you don't need to have a work cited. I know where you're getting your sources from, more or less. But you will have to have the text cited properly in the paper itself. Whenever you quote something, paraphrase something from the textbook or the source reader, you can give the title in italicized letters, America, and the page number where you got it from, basically. You'll mention what the source is, of course, in the course of your paper, but they should be cited. I'll give you examples of how to do that. Now, one other thing I want to talk about, besides how to answer the essay, and I'll go into this in more detail and try to find, if I can, some examples of what this type of essay might look like for you, is one note about developments, and I actually have this on the assignment sheet itself. Something students normally struggle with is that when I say what developments, play out over time, which lead to people's ideas about what national identity are in America in the early 1800s. What I mean by development is not necessarily, it's not an event or a person. It's a pattern of change over time. Why does that matter? It's a big difference, actually. It's one thing to say that, well, I'll give you an example. Sometimes students will say things like, well, what formed our national identity in the early 1800s was George Washington, because he was such a great leader, and, he laid down, he could have become king, he didn't. He's part of what led us to have our sense of national identity that we did in the early 1800s. That's not what I'm looking for. Why is that not what I'm looking for? You're referring to a specific historical actor, a person, who's hugely important, of course. But what I'm asking you to do is, and you can mention George Washington, by the way. There's no problem with that. Is I want you to place a person like that, Washington, Jefferson, whomever, in the context of a larger pattern of change over time. Give me an example how you would fit that into a development or a process. You could talk about George Washington as being part of a pattern of the spread of Enlightenment ideas. To give you one example, take religion. I think it's in your major problem source reader, if I'm not mistaken. There's a very famous letter he writes to a Jewish synagogue in 1790, shortly after he becomes president, in which he proclaims that America believes in religious toleration. And the phrase is famous, to bigotry no sanction, something like that, right? That's evidence for an influence of Enlightenment ideals, because George Washington, like most of his compatriots, he's Protestant. Like his Vice President John Adams, they all grew up Protestant, and especially in New England, they didn't like Catholics very much, very anti-Catholic. George Washington was pretty anti-Catholic when he was younger, so was John Adams. But under the influence of Enlightenment ideals and the events that led up to, and including the Revolutionary War and everything, their thinking changed. And so what you can talk about, if you're talking about a development that plays into national identity, you can talk about how those events and ideas mix together to form a different sense of, what religions means for the United States, which is different, by the way. It's one of the things that marks it out is very different from, say, Britain, which has its own state church and everything. That would be that's an example of individual events or individual ideas or individual people fitting into larger patterns, right? I don't want the influence of one single idea or one single movement on something. I want the pattern of change over time, the pattern of people's actions and events that lead to something, basically. I hope that makes sense that I say it. And again, what I write in the actual assignment sheet is developments are processes, not singular events or people. They are patterns of multiple events, individual people, multiple people, or beliefs or ideas over time, usually over longer periods of time, at least a few decades. When I say long-term developments, I mean at least a few decades. And they can be economic, they can be environmental changes over time, they can be cultural changes over time, religious, intellectual, what have you. They don't have to be political, although they can be that. Probably would be that for the purpose of your essays. They don't have to be. But probably the biggest thing about developments is they're usually they're larger patterns, more than one single event, one single idea, one single person, and how they affect things. And long term, again, being at least a few decades. So, yeah. That's probably overcomplicating things for you, but I want to give you some detail on this, and I'll talk about it more, and I'll show you some of this going forward. I can apologize for the camera cut off there. You have 2 videos of this week, or if I managed to merge them into one, I don't know. But that's my little preview of the midterm. Hope you guys keep up with the readings. Please email me, contact me if you have any questions about it. Again, I'll have something up next few days. At the bare minimum, next week's video address, but probably more than that. I'll try to have up, and I'll notify you when I get an example to show you what I'm looking for. That's a preview. I hope you guys have a great week. Take care, and enjoy this week's readings.